Picture this. You're 21 years old. It's Saturday night in November, and you're living your best college life in a small town where everyone knows everyone. You grab dinner with friends, hit the local club, laugh until your sides hurt, and stumble home with your best friend at 2 a.m., completely unaware that in less than 3 hours, your world will change forever. This is the story of what happened at 1122 King Road, a house that looked exactly like every other college rental in America. 6 roommates living together, sharing the chaos of late-night study sessions, weekend parties, and the kind of friendships that feel like they'll last forever. But here's what makes this different from every other college house story you've heard. 4 of those roommates would never see another sunrise. And the 2 who survived would witness something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Now, I know what you're thinking. Another tragic story about young lives cut short. But this case has layers that will make you question everything you think you know about safety, about trust, about the person living right next door to you. Between 10 p.m. and 1:30 a.m. on November 12th, 2022, 2 of the housemates were at the Corner Club, a local hangout. At 1:40 a.m., they were captured on surveillance footage at a food truck, laughing, ordering late-night snacks, completely ordinary college students doing completely ordinary things. That food truck footage, it would become some of the last images of them alive. But here's what you don't know yet. While they were ordering their food, someone else was already planning their final hours. By 4:25 a.m., investigators believe all 4 victims were dead, stabbed multiple times with a large fixed-blade knife that was never found, in a house where 2 other roommates were sleeping just floors below. Think about that for a moment. You're in your own home, in your own bed, surrounded by people you trust. The doors are locked. You feel safe, but someone is already inside. Around 4 a.m., one of the surviving roommates was woken up by strange noises. Footsteps, voices. But here's the thing about living in a college house. Strange noises at 4 a.m. aren't exactly unusual, are they? People coming home late, talking in the hallway, maybe someone's TV too loud. So she did what any of us would do. She tried to go back to sleep, but the noises didn't stop. According to court documents, she heard crying, opened her door, and saw a figure in black clothing and a mask walking through her house. A stranger, in her home, moving through the hallway like he belonged there. She froze. Wouldn't you? Your brain trying to make sense of what you're seeing, wondering if you're dreaming, if this is real, if you should scream or hide or run. She watched this masked figure walk through her house and leave. And then silence. For the next several hours, she stayed in her room, locked her door, waited, tried to convince herself that what she saw couldn't have been what she thought it was. When morning came, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Her roommates weren't answering their phones, weren't coming downstairs for their usual Sunday morning coffee. At 11:58 a.m., one of the surviving roommates called 911, initially reporting an unconscious person, mentioning they had seen some man in their house last night. What police found inside that house would launch one of the most complex murder investigations in recent history. Evidence that would point to someone living just miles away, someone studying the very crimes he allegedly committed, someone who thought he was smart enough to get away with murder. But here's what's going to keep you watching. The killer made mistakes. Digital footprints he thought were untraceable. Physical evidence he didn't know he left behind. And a trail of behavior that would ultimately lead investigators right to his door. Over the next 20 minutes, we're going to walk through every piece of this puzzle. The final night of 4 young lives. The investigation that gripped a nation. The arrest that shocked a community. And the questions that still remain unanswered. Because this isn't just a story about a crime. It's about how quickly everything you think you know about safety can shatter. How someone can be studying criminal justice while allegedly planning the perfect murder. And how the truth, when it finally emerges, can be stranger than anything you could imagine. Stay with me. Trust me when I tell you, you haven't heard anything yet. Let me take you back to November 12th, 2022. Just another Saturday in the life of 4 college students who had no idea they were living their last day on Earth. 2 of our victims, let's call them the best friends, had been inseparable since middle school. At 21, they were seniors about to graduate, about to start their real lives. That Saturday evening, they decided to hit their usual spot, the Corner Club, a local bar where college students went to blow off steam. They arrived at the Corner Club around 10 p.m. and stayed until 1:30 a.m., exactly the kind of night you'd expect from college seniors. Drinks, dancing, probably complaining about upcoming finals, making plans for after graduation. Normal. Completely, beautifully normal. But here's where it gets interesting. While the best friends were at the club, the couple, a 20-year-old young man and his girlfriend, were at a completely different location. They were at a Sigma Chi fraternity party on campus, arriving around 8 p.m. Now think about this. For people, two different locations, all having what they thought was just another Saturday night. They had no way of knowing that someone else was already watching, already planning, already deciding that this would be their last night alive. At 1:40 a.m., the best friends were captured on surveillance footage at a food truck, that now famous video you've probably seen if you follow this case. They're laughing, ordering late-night food, completely unaware that someone had been tracking their movements. Meanwhile, the couple returned home to the King Road house at 1:45 a.m., just 5 minutes after the best friends were caught on camera getting their food. The timing is crucial here, and you'll understand why in a moment. By 2 a.m., all 4 victims were home. The house was settling in for the night. 2 roommates were already asleep on the first floor. Everything seemed normal, safe, secure. But according to investigators, someone else was already in the area. Cell phone data would later show that the suspect had been in the area of the victim's home multiple times in the months before the attack. This wasn't random. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was planned, calculated, and the person responsible had been studying their routines, their habits, their vulnerabilities for months. Here's what makes this case truly chilling. The suspect was a graduate student in criminology. He was literally studying how to solve crimes while allegedly planning the perfect murder. Think about that level of calculation, that twisted confidence. Between 4 o'clock and 4:25 a.m., investigators believe all 4 victims were killed, stabbed multiple times with a large fixed-blade knife that has never been found. But here's the detail that will haunt you. A knife sheath was left at the crime scene, a mistake that would ultimately lead to the killer's capture. That sheath contained something the killer didn't expect to leave behind, something microscopic but absolutely damning. DNA evidence that would later be determined to be at least 5.37 octillion times more likely to belong to the suspect than any random person. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because between 4:25 a.m., when the last victim died, and 11:58 a.m., when police were called, something extraordinary was happening in that house. One of the surviving roommates had witnessed something that would break this case wide open. Now, here's where the story becomes absolutely extraordinary. Around 4 a.m., one of the surviving roommates, let's call her the witness, was awakened by what she later described as sounds coming from upstairs. In a house full of college students, this wasn't unusual. People come home late, move around, talk on the phone. But these sounds were different. She heard what she later told investigators sounded like one of her roommates playing with her dog. Then, just minutes later, she heard something that made her blood run cold. One of her housemates saying, "There's someone here." Think about that moment. You're lying in your bed, half asleep, and you hear someone in your house, someone you live with, say those 3 words. There's someone here. Not someone's at the door, or did you hear that? But there's someone here. Present tense. In the house. Right now. The witness opened her bedroom door. What she heard next would haunt her forever. Crying coming from one of the victim's rooms, and then a male voice saying something to the effect of, "It's okay. I'm going to help you." Let that sink in for a moment. A stranger's voice in her house, talking to her dying roommate, pretending to offer help while committing murder. The calculated coldness of those words, "It's okay, I'm going to help you," while holding a knife. The witness opened her door again, and that's when she saw him. A man dressed in black with a mask over his nose and mouth walking toward her direction. A complete stranger moving through her house like he owned it. Here's what's incredible about human psychology under extreme stress. She froze. Just completely froze. Your brain can't process what it's seeing. Is this real? Is this happening? Should I scream? Should I run? Should I hide? She watched this masked figure walk through her house and head toward a sliding glass door. Then, in what was probably the smartest decision of her life, she locked herself in her room and stayed there. For the next 7.5 hours, she stayed locked in that room. Imagine that. 7.5 hours of not knowing if the person who killed your roommates was still in the house. 7.5 hours of wondering if you're next. 7.5 hours of complete terror. When morning came and the house remained silent, she and the other surviving roommate finally called for help. Heavy breathing and crying can be heard in the 911 call audio as the surviving roommates passed the phone between them, answering the dispatcher in fragmented responses. But here's what makes this case absolutely extraordinary. The witness description would prove to be incredibly valuable. She had seen the killer in person, up close, and her testimony would become a crucial piece of the puzzle. Meanwhile, 2,500 miles away in Pennsylvania, a graduate student in criminology was probably thinking he had committed the perfect crime. He had studied forensic science. He understood criminal investigations. He thought he was smarter than everyone else. Bryan Kohberger was a doctoral student at nearby Washington State University, just 10 miles from the crime scene. For months, he had been driving through the victim's neighborhood, studying their routines, planning his attack. But here's where his arrogance became his downfall. DNA evidence was found on a K-bar knife sheath left near one of the victim's bodies. A single piece of evidence that he probably didn't even realize he had left behind. Investigators used investigative genetic genealogy, combining DNA analysis with genealogical research to connect that sample to the suspect's family. They traced his family tree through public databases, narrowed down potential suspects, and eventually identified him. On December 30th, 2022, police arrested him at his family's home in Pennsylvania. Trash recovered from the family home revealed a DNA profile linked to DNA on the knife sheath found at the crime scene. Even his own garbage betrayed him. The man who thought he was smart enough to commit the perfect murder had made fundamental mistakes that any first-year criminology student would know to avoid. And now, all of his academic knowledge about criminal investigations was being used against him. But the DNA evidence was just the beginning. What investigators discovered next would reveal the true extent of the suspect's obsession with his victims. Cell phone records showed his phone had been near the crime scene at least 12 times in the months leading up to the murders, starting in August 2022. Think about that. This wasn't a random crime. This was someone who had been studying his targets for months. 12 separate times he had driven to their neighborhood, probably watching, probably learning their routines, probably planning the perfect time to strike. The breakthrough came when investigators realized they were looking for a white Hyundai Elantra that had been seen in the area around the time of the murders. Thousands of hours of surveillance footage were collected, and authorities used video, GPS tracking, and cell phone triangulation to build a timeline of the suspect's movements. The suspect had driven his white Elantra from his apartment in Washington State, just 9.5 miles from the crime scene, straight to the victim's neighborhood. The digital evidence was overwhelming. Every ping from his phone, every camera that caught his vehicle, every electronic footprint he left behind was building an unbreakable chain of evidence. But here's where it gets really interesting. After the murders, the suspect made a decision that would ultimately seal his fate. Instead of staying local and trying to blend in, he drove 2,500 miles across the country to his parents' house in Pennsylvania for Christmas. The FBI tracked him the entire way. They knew exactly where he was, what route he took, and when he arrived. They were building their case methodically, waiting for the right moment to strike. And when they finally had everything they needed, they moved. The irony is incredible. A man studying criminal justice, learning about forensic science, understanding how investigations work, and he left behind a trail of evidence that a graduate student in his own program could have followed. Today, the suspect sits in an Idaho jail, awaiting trial on 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The trial has been delayed multiple times and is now scheduled to begin in August 2025. Prosecutors are seeking the death penalty. His defense team is arguing that cell phone data shows he was nowhere near the crime scene when the killings occurred. They claim he was just taking late-night drives, hiking, stargazing, innocent activities that have been misinterpreted by investigators. But the evidence against him continues to mount. The DNA on the knife sheath. The cell phone data placing him at the scene multiple times. The surveillance footage of his vehicle. The witness who saw him leave the house. The defense is also arguing that their client has autism spectrum disorder, which could affect how a jury perceives his behavior and actions. They're fighting to have key evidence thrown out, including the witness testimony from the surviving roommate. Recent developments have complicated the case further. A Dateline special aired new information about the murders, and the defense is now arguing for another trial delay, claiming their client cannot receive a fair trial due to media coverage. But here's what we know for certain. For young people are dead. Their families are still seeking justice. A community has been forever changed, and the questions that remain may never be fully answered. Why did he choose these specific victims? How long had he been planning this attack? What drove a graduate student studying criminal justice to allegedly commit the very crimes he was learning to solve? The trial scheduled for August 2025 may finally provide answers to these questions. But for the families of the victims, for the surviving roommates, and for a community that has lived with this nightmare for over 2 years, the real question isn't just what happened that night. It's how do you move forward when the unthinkable becomes reality? This case reminds us that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. That the person studying how to catch killers might be planning to become one himself, and that sometimes the most important evidence isn't what the killer leaves behind, it's what the survivors remember. As we await the trial that may finally bring justice for these 4 young victims, we're left with a chilling reminder. In a world where technology tracks our every move, where DNA can be matched across generations, and where surveillance cameras watch our every step, the most dangerous criminals might be the ones who think they're smart enough to outsmart the system. They're usually wrong. Behind every unsolved mystery is a story that matters. Subscribe and help keep their stories alive.